Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, I interviewed the founder of one of the earliest and most influential tech blogs. These days, nearly every major news organization employs multiple reporters who aggressively cover the tech industry, but a decade ago, tech coverage was dominated by blogs like TechCrunch, Mashable, and VentureBeat. Back then, these blogs churned out scoop after scoop, competed for traffic, and sometimes even went to war with each other. Among the earliest of these blogs was ReadWriteWeb. Launched in 2003, it was founded by Richard MacManus, a New Zealander who was inspired to launch a site after reading the work of blog pioneer Dave Weiner. Within a few years, MacManus began selling ads and was able to hire a global staff of reporters. I recently interviewed MacManus about the early days of tech blogging and why, for his latest writing project, he decided to eschew blogging entirely and launched a newsletter instead. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my email newsletter. If you're not subscribed, then you're missing out on some of the most in-depth analysis on the media industry that you'll find anywhere. This week, for instance, I wrote a long piece about why every publisher at this point should have a podcast strategy. If you're not subscribed, then you should pause this episode right now and go to simonowens.substack.com to sign up. But don't just take my word for it. Here's digital marketing consultant Cameron Bailey talking about why he thinks people should sign up for my newsletter.
Surprises me every time I read it, probably because it actually presents to me articles of interest that I wouldn't have found otherwise. So you're either articles that you've written yourself or articles that you've curated and suggest and recommend. So I like it because it constantly surprises me with new articles that I wouldn't have found otherwise.
Again, if you want to subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, now let's jump to my interview with Richard MacManus. Hey, Richard, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Simon. It's a pleasure.
So you played a very important role in the web's history in that you founded one of the earliest and most influential tech blogs all the way back in 2003. It was called ReadWriteWeb. What were you doing prior to launching it?
I was actually working as a web manager at the time for a corporation in New Zealand. So I was doing kind of looking after the internal and external websites for this company. It was a local power company. And I was, I was also on the side kind of reading up on all the latest technologies and getting really interested in things like RSS and blogging. And truth be told, my day job was a little bit boring, so I decided I'll start a blog in order to explore these new technologies. So that's kind of the genesis of ReadWriteWeb.
And what was your sense of blogging in 2003? Not many people were making money from blogging back then. Did you? First of all, what did tech blogging look like back then? Were there any precursors to ReadWriteWeb that you were reading?
Well, first of all, there was no money in it back then, so I didn't start it with the intention of building a business or anything like that. So I was following people like Dave Weiner, John Udall, and a bunch of other kind of more tech-focused people. And so I was following a lot of those type of people to learn about things like RSS and wikis and all this new kind of stuff that was bubbling up at the time. And there was also some people in what they used to call knowledge management. I'm not sure if they still call it that, but they were sort of less geeky and more sort of about how to use, these new technologies for knowledge management and corporations and so on. So it was kind of a mix of things, but I'd say the main influence was Dave Weiner and the type of bloggers that used his platform. And indeed, I used Radio Userland to start with, which was Dave's software.
Yeah, and Dave is considered one of the original bloggers, and also helped develop RSS, which was a main kind of distribution mechanism for blogs. But his blog was definitely, you can still read it today. He still writes on it today. It definitely doesn't look like what we can typically consider as like a tech news website, like the TechCrunches and the Verges, the things that came later, and what ReadWriteWeb turned into. to was like, so walk me through the launch of ReadWriteWeb. Was it something that was like before it became kind of an actual, reporting operation? Was it kind of like Dave Weiner's blog, where it was a little bit more personal and kind of like these kind of personal essays and ruminations on technology? What was kind of that those early days of ReadWriteWeb like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I first started using Radio Userland in 2002, early 2002, and at that point, I, basically just used it as a link blog. I'm not sure if the term was floating about at the time, but I would just sort of write links and a couple of comments. And towards the end of that year, I thought,
kind of like what Twitter is today in some senses, like just 280 characters max, and then you're linking to something.
Yeah, exactly. So towards the end of 2002, I was thinking, well, I'd really like to use this to do longer form stuff, because my background, I was a graduate of English literature, so I was always interested in writing. So I really wanted to, go a bit more in depth in my writing. So in 2003, I kind of relaunched it as ReadWriteWeb, with the intention of writing longer form articles that were analyzing the latest web trends and, tracking them. And so I'd say my content was maybe like Dave's longer form articles, but he was also writing a lot of short form stuff as well. So he was very prolific and still is. I was a bit more, I'd maybe do one post every couple of days or something like that. So I wasn't trying to do a blog post every single day. I was trying to track certain themes and sort of dig into the latest technologies and trends a little bit more in each article.
And how did you start to find a readership?
Well, it actually happened fairly quickly and organically. It was because what I found was I was connecting with people. First of all, I was connecting with other bloggers like Dave Weiner and his kind of circle. And so they began to read my stuff as I linked to them and as I commented on their blog posts. But I was also connecting to an audience of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who were kind of experimenting with the latest technologies. This was after the dot-com boom and bust, but before the whole Web 2.0 thing happened a couple of years later. So it was kind of an experimental period, and there were a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly in Silicon Valley, who were testing out things and wanted to find out more about RSS and blogging and wikis and all that kind of social software it was called back then. And I was, writing about this stuff and analyzing this stuff. So I just happened to pick up those types of people as interested readers. And so, my readership in the early days was kind of a mix of techie people and entrepreneurial people.
And like, in terms of like how it evolved over time, did you start? So it started out as like your kind of analysis. Did you start like adding in original reporting? Did startups start reaching out to you for coverage? How did it evolve in terms of its coverage?
Yeah, so I think in 2004 was the first Web 2.0 conference, I think, that Tim O'Reilly and his company put on in John Patel. So, and that was sort of around September, October, I think. So about that time, people began to become aware that there was a business in this, in terms of like there were startups being built around the technologies that were that were labeled Web 2.0 by Tim O'Reilly. And so that's kind of when I think I began to sort of write, I guess, what you'd call news articles, in terms of like, this is a new product and I've just reviewed it today. It wasn't like a journalist type of article, but it was kind of heading in that direction, I guess. And 2005 was I think 2005 was the year when that started to ramp up quite a lot. I think TechCrunch started that year, or was it the year after? I can't quite recall now.
Yeah, sometime around 2005, I think.
Yeah. And actually, I think it was the middle of 2005, and Michael Arrington actually reached out to me that the very first week that he launched, and said that he was a reader of ReadWriteWeb. So we connected pretty early on, and likewise I connected early on with other sort of tech bloggers as well. So there was quite a community feel to it back at that time as well. 2004, 2005, which I really enjoyed.
And was there like And was there kind of like a vacuum in coverage that you guys were kind of filling? Like, I seem to remember that back then the tech blogs were running circles around the mainstream press. These days, you have very aggressive coverage of tech in all the major newspapers. But do you think that the mainstream media was kind of slow to pick up on the role that tech would play in all of our lives? Like, do you feel like tech blogs back then were really kind of leading the coverage in terms of startups and these companies that would later become household names?
Yeah, absolutely. I think tech blogs were probably maybe even 4 or 5 years ahead of the mainstream media in terms of writing about these topics and understanding the importance of them. So I feel like it was only around, maybe, in fact, I think ReadWriteWeb was syndicated to the New York Times starting in around about 2008. And, GigaOM and VentureBeat were also syndicated, so it wasn't just us. But I think at that point, the New York Times was kind of thinking, well, it'd be great to have this type of content on our website, but we still don't quite understand how to do it. So that's why they syndicated our sites for a little while. And of course, nowadays they do it all themselves and do a great job of it. So, but it did take several years for them to sort of understand the blog model, I guess, in terms of being very passionate about writing about this type of content, but also understanding the sort of negatives as well, which I think, to be fair, I think tech blogs were a little slow on that front as well.
So my sense was that the second generation of blogs were kind of up and really going at, by 2006 at the latest. You had you guys, TechCrunch, VentureBeat, Gizmodo, Engadget, all these. And they became like I felt like they were just churning out tons of content. They were all like really very much competing for scoops, and there was tons of curation. My sense was that ReadWriteWeb had a slower metabolism than a lot of these other tech blogs that were churning out dozens of posts a day. Like, am I remembering that correctly, that you guys were still a much slower, more thoughtful analysis type blog versus, like a Gizmodo, which was just aggregating every little tiny piece of news that came out of the tech space?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And partly that was to do with the fact that I wasn't based in Silicon Valley, and neither was most of my team. There were a couple of people there eventually. But so I realized pretty quickly, that I wasn't going to get the scoops that someone like Michael Arrington was, or even, a site like Mashable, although, they started out as more just a cover all bases kind of thing. Well, actually, that's not fair. Pete Cashmore started that more as he was very interested in the social side of things, and then it turned into an all-you-can-eat kind of buffet. But so ReadWriteWeb was always a little bit different in that we were, because we didn't have as many people on the ground as those other sites, and we also, our content, right back to the start from when I started, was more analytical and thoughtful and purposely so. And so the people that I hired, like Marshall Kirkpatrick, and the people that wrote for the site, like Alex Iskold in the early days, were very sort of intelligent, thoughtful, analytical people. And so, we just evolved that way, and we continued to do sort of less articles than most of the other tech blogs, but more in-depth articles. And that was kind of our modus operandi, all the way through, really.
But do you feel like you kind of got left behind at all? Because I feel like a lot of the other blogs kind of sprinted ahead of you in terms of traffic and in terms of being the first people that like PR flax would give scoops to. Did you feel like because you were lower metabolism and back then like a lot of traffic was dependent on how many articles you put out a day, that you guys kind of suffered because of that?
No, I don't think so, because our audience was also a very sort of influential audience. So there were decision makers, entrepreneurs actually building things, and executives and developers. So it turned out to be a really influential audience. And so, because the business model back then was primarily online advertising, we were able to have quite high CPMs in terms of our sponsorship rates and our advertising revenue. And also we were able to sort of branch out into premium sort of other premium business models. For example, we did 3 events over 2009 to 2011, and we did premium reports as well. So we were kind of one of the first tech blogs to do that. So we found kind of ways to create revenue that were based on the influence of the audience. And although we were doing less content, it was more high value content, and so we were able to create a high value business model to complement that. So whereas a lot of those other sites like Gizmodo and Mashable, they were getting like loads more page views than us, but their CPM rates were quite a lot lower as well, and they weren't able to branch out into premium reports and that kind of thing.
What was online advertising in those early days? Was it all just kind of based on one-to-one transactions? Like, obviously, I'm guessing programmatic advertising didn't really exist yet. Was it really just like, you had an advertising page and and startups and other tech companies were reaching out and saying, hey, what's your rate to like put a little, banner ad up or something like that?
Yeah, well, it started out, I think my first ads were maybe in 2005, and it was through me reaching out to people, and because a lot of them were entrepreneurs and startups, trying to get traction on their projects. They were interested in being a sponsor on ReadWriteWeb, so that's kind of how it started. And then in early 2006, I partnered with FM Publishing, which is John Battel's company, and so his company was able to sell relatively high CPM adverts, display adverts for bigger companies, Microsoft and Oracle and all that kind of thing. So in the end, it ended up being a mix of sponsorships that we would sell directly, and they were mostly to startups. For example, Zoho was a long-time sponsor of ReadWriteWeb, and a mix of that and the adverts, the display advertising that FM Publishing would sell. So it ended up being, really a nice model. Actually, the two things kind of balanced each other.
Well, like, what in terms of the business of advertising back then, do you think that was or do you think that would have been better than if you were to still run ReadWriteWeb today and have to deal with the advertising market today? Like, do you think that it's improved for publishers, or do you kind of have nostalgia for those days when it was really just about direct sales and you weren't selling remainder ads for increasingly smaller amounts and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I definitely do have nostalgia for those days, because it was, for a time there, it was a great way to earn a living as an online media, entrepreneur. So, and these days it's obviously much, much tougher. A site like, ReadWriteWeb these days would have to go down the subscription model, and I guess turn into something like what Rafid Ali is doing with his current company, Skift. So it's premium content, and there's also events and there's more things that he's doing with his community. So I think that would probably be more the model today for a site like ReadWriteWeb. But it's definitely a lot tougher to earn a living in online media these days, as you know.
And so what made you eventually decide to sell the website?
I eventually sold it at the end of 2011. And so I'd been running it for, about 8 years at that point. And I was, so I wanted to take it to the next level in terms of, it was doing really well. It had great page views, and page views were growing, and engagement was growing, and revenue was growing. And it was a profitable company as well. But I kind of knew that to take it to the next level, to compete with the likes of TechCrunch and VentureBeat and so on, it would need to have a presence in America. And so the options were I could either take some VC funding to establish a base in San Francisco, or to sell it to a larger media company. And I chose to do the latter, mainly because of my own personal circumstances. I couldn't make the move to live in the US. So I thought, well, if I can't do that, I may as well look for a bigger company to kind of take over and, take it to that next level. And so that was the reasoning to sell. And also, to be honest, I was a little burnt out at that point as well, because I'd been, working really hard on this business for 8 or so years, and it was just time to take a little step back. So those were the reasons, and eventually, we found what we thought was a good partner in Same Media, who who wanted to take it to the next level, and they would establish a base for the company in their offices in downtown San Francisco. So it was kind of the perfect scenario, really. So we ended up selling at the end of 2011.
Yeah, Same Media is an interesting company. It had like a variety of pivots and business models. It was trying to be like a content management, a publishing platform, and an ad network, and it kind of moved around. So at first, it was buying up content companies like ReadWriteWeb, where it was producing the original content, but then it kind of closed down a lot of those operations, and instead it started partnering with publishing companies to they would produce the content, like individual blogs, and then Same Media would focus on just running the publishing platform and finding advertisers and splitting advertising revenue. How well do you think Same Media managed the site after they took over? Were you kind of disappointed that they kind of got out of producing original content?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, they pivoted quite a lot, and so there were kind of three key people in Same Media at the time that they acquired ReadWriteWeb, and two of those people left fairly quickly after ReadWriteWeb joined, within about 3 or 4 months. So I kind of, at that point I was thinking, well, okay, this is maybe not looking so promising anymore, because the people who wanted to buy ReadWriteWeb for their specific purposes to take it to the next level were now gone. So, and from that point on, it started to get a little, they didn't put the resources into the site that they had told me that they would. So, unfortunately, the site also had some technical issues, because they changed the domain from readwriteweb.com to readwrite.com. And that apparently caused a lot of problems, because that actual change happened when I left, which was 9 months later. But I was told later on that actually caused the traffic to plummet and caused a whole lot of problems for the brand in general. So there were things like that that were kind of not particularly done well, and also the focus of the site itself kind of changed around quite a lot too. At one point, when they acquired the site, the plan was to really sort of expand the coverage, a bit like what sites like The Verge and Recode ended up doing, because technology was infiltrating everything at that point, 2011, 2012. So the plan was to really expand the coverage to cover technology, digital technology in every sort of industry. But as I say, the resources were not put into the site to enable that. So we didn't have enough writers to do that. We didn't necessarily have the support of, the top level management at Same Media, since, two of the key people had left. And so, yeah, all in all, it was a little unsatisfying. And, they ended up on selling the site to another company as well. And that's another story.
And so what's it doing? So I think it's still publishing. Is it still doing robust tech reporting, or what's really going on with it?
Yeah, so it was on-sold to a company called Wearable World, and they were focused on wearables at the time, wearable technology, and they turned it into a site that focused just on that, and also Internet of Things. And then I think they dropped the wearable technology part completely, and now it's just all about Internet of Things. But as far as I can tell, there's very, very few writers, and a lot of this stuff seems to be kind of sponsored content, or that kind of thing. So it's certainly nothing like what it was, back when I was running the site. It's not a general technology site anymore. It's very focused on one thing, and it seems to be very kind of enterprisey type content. So yeah, it's just totally different now.
So I know you recently published or started a new publishing project, but and we'll talk about that in a moment, but what did you get up to in the years following the sale?
Yeah, so my intention when I left ReadWrite, which is I think it was about October 2012, was to write a book because I'd always wanted to write a book. So I wrote a non-fiction book called Trackers, which was about health technology, and that was published 2013. Well, I wrote that over 2013 and it was published at the end of that year and into 2014. And after that, I changed kind of tack a little bit and wrote another book, but it was a science fiction novel called Presence, and that was about speculating on the future of virtual reality. So, I wrote 2 books. Neither of them were hugely successful, but, I loved doing them and I always wanted to do it. And so kind of around about 2016, 2017, I wanted to get back into online media in some way. So since then, I've done a few different projects trying to sort of find my niche again. Because things have changed quite a lot since the Web 2.0 days. So I wrote a blog about blockchain last year, which and the idea was to talk about the actual product side of blockchain and not the financial speculation. But unfortunately, I discovered people were not particularly interested in the product side, so it didn't really gain the readership that I'd wanted. So this year I changed tack and decided, well, I've always loved the cultural industries and, I did an English literature degree and so on. So I'd love to write more about the intersection of technology and the cultural industries because there's been so much change in that area. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm running an email newsletter called Cybercultural.
And so while there is a certain level of irony here that it's a newsletter, given that you're one of the original successful bloggers, why launch a newsletter instead of another blog?
Yeah, well, I think I found when I was doing the blog last year, it was called Blogsplain, and it was a blog. It wasn't, it was intentionally a blog to try and get back to that kind of early read-write-web model. But it just, the market just isn't there for blogging anymore in terms of advertising, sponsorship. And I also found it's really difficult to get engagement on social media these days because there's so much noise and so many competing people with content on a variety of platforms. And so I just found I wasn't reaching the people that I wanted to reach with the blog format and with trying to promote it on social media. So that's what kind of attracted me to the email newsletter model, and in particular companies like Substack, who I run Cybercultural on. They seem to have basically evolved the blogging model. So, it's pretty similar to the blogging model actually in terms of the production of the content, because you write in the browser and it's got a great sort of editor in the browser, and they also publish the content. Substack also publishes the content online as well. So it's kind of a blog post and an email. So I thought that was really neat as well. So yeah, basically I decided to give it a go.
Yeah, the Substack publishing platform, it's very attractive and well designed, and someone could consume your content on there and never even realize that it's a newsletter if they really wanted to. Like, you could write it like it's just a blog because that's what it looks like, but it's also really efficient to a lot of people who are publishing on Substack, or the primary way that people are reading their content is through email. And so I've interviewed several people for this podcast who have launched on Substack. Is what kind of attracted you to the platform?
I'd been reading a few Substack newsletters, Matt Taibbi's email newsletter, for example, and I really liked the way the content was presented by email, and also I was clicking through and saying, oh well, this is actually a really cool blog-like interface as well. And so, and the other thing that attracted me to Substack in particular was one of the co-founders, Hamish McKenzie, is actually a New Zealander. So I'd known him for a while. And so I reached out to him, or maybe he reached out to me. I can't quite remember now. But we connected anyway. And recently when I was in San Francisco, I sat down and had a beer with him, and we talked about, the model and what Substack was doing, and they were looking for more writers like me. So I thought I'd give it a go, and it's I'm really enjoying the platform so far.
And so tell me a little bit. So you said the intersection of technology and culture. So you're covering like musicians who are using the internet, video creators, like anybody who creates. Usually it's focused on some kind of content, whether it's music, video, podcast, text, blog or article content. Is that kind of the gist of what you cover?
Yeah. So sometimes it's called the creative industries, sometimes it's called the cultural industries. So the term itself is a little contested, and it has different meanings for different people. But basically, what you just said is any person or company that's creating content, whether that's music, other audio, media, books, anything really along those lines. And one of the kind of reasons I started it was because I felt like the social media era, there's been a ton of content, like there's a ton of content out there. And this whole Web 2.0 notion of user-generated content, had reached its apex with social media sites like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. But there's a lot of noise, but I feel like the cultural content gets kind of squeezed out in many respects. So I felt like that was worth kind of exploring. I mean, there's so much potential to use digital technology, to empower cultural content, and it is being used that way, but we're not necessarily hearing about it. So that's why I decided to kind of devote a whole newsletter / blog to it. And also it just, some of the leading companies in the space like Spotify and Netflix and Amazon, they've just transformed the way culture is produced and distributed and sold and consumed in such a deep way that I felt it was something worth exploring on a regular basis. So those were the reasons.
How often are you publishing?
Well, I started out doing 3 a week. And the intention, my original goal was to launch paid subscriptions on the 1st of July. And so I've got a great audience so far, but it's still not quite there, not quite ready yet for paid subscriptions. So I've kind of put that on hold while I continue to sort of look and, continue to experiment with different formats and see what works, see what doesn't, see what value I can produce for an audience to entice them to pay. So it's still very much in the kind of beta phase where I'm still trying to work out how I can make this into a business. So I've gone back to a one article per week model for now while I do a bit of background stuff and do some more research and try some more things out and so on. So it's still early stage at this point.
Yeah, I think people are getting too enthusiastic about paid newsletters because there have been a few success cases. And I think maybe you're right to wait and continue to build kind of that brand loyalty because I think paid newsletters are a very tough nut to crack, to try to get those 1,000 to 2,000 people to actually pay up and subscribe. And I wonder if like a lot of people are going into it launching the paid version almost immediately, and they're finding that there isn't as much of an appetite to sign up as they thought there would be.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult nut to crack. And I think the other thing that people lose sight of is that the success stories so far in email newsletters, the Ben Thompsons of the world, him in particular gets cited quite a lot. But he was doing that for several years at least before he, earned some money from it. And in fact, I believe he was doing consulting to start with, which was very similar to what I did with ReadWriteWeb when I was trying to get that off the ground. So I think it just, people lose sight of the fact that it takes time to build these brands and takes time to build an audience. And also it takes time to find the value that you can actually give people that they're willing to pay for. Because I don't think mainstream subscriptions is still not completely mainstream. I mean, people may pay for the New York Times or the Washington Post, but there's still a leap that needs to happen in order to get them to pay for a niche publication. So I don't think we're quite there yet as an industry as well. But certainly there's success stories out there, and Ben Thompson is by all accounts making over $1 million a year on this thing. But those are few and far between at this point, and it's going to take time. And I think maybe I was a little optimistic when I launched it, thinking I could go to paid subscriptions on 1st of July, I've sort of realized now that it's going to take a bit more time than that to really build the value in the newsletter.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone thinking about going that route, they have one of two options. One, they need a lot of runway to be producing a lot of free content for a good period of time so that they can really kind of become a habit for their readers and build up a sizable subscription base. Or I'm seeing some other success from some that are working for like mainstream media outlets and using making a salary there, but also using those to build up an audience and a following, and then quitting their jobs and then launching these newsletters and using that following, all that goodwill that they built up. Like one in Jed Legume, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, but he was at Think Progress, which is a political site he was this editor-in-chief for years. I think he founded that site. So after 10 plus years of running that site, then he quit and then launched on Substack, and I think he was an instant success, but that was after 10 years of publishing and being like a very prominent presence on like Twitter and elsewhere, that he was able to succeed to that extent.
Yeah, I actually listened to his interview on the Substack podcast the other day, and yeah, you're right. I mean, he already had a well-established presence, and he also has a huge Twitter following, I understand. So, yeah. But having said that, I do feel optimistic about the future, for email newsletters, and I also think once things like bundling come into play, and by that I mean if somebody could sign up to like a bundle of myself and two other similar but not quite the same tech bloggers. I think that might be and I know Substack is exploring this, but that might make it slightly easier to gain readers and revenue as well. So it's still early days. So I still think it's the subscription model is great if you can slowly ramp up and get devoted readers who are willing to pay you a little bit every month. It's got legs, but it just takes more longer than people think it does at this point.
So you've come a long way in the evolution of tech coverage. How do you think? So today, the news industry is very aggressive in covering tech. Like every major newspaper has like very top tier tech writers everywhere, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times to Bloomberg. But then you also have very robust niche publications like The Verge, Recode. I could list 10 off the top of my head. Do you think that like the way that the press covers tech has evolved a lot? Has it become more sophisticated? I seem to remember it was very scoop driven back in 2007, 2008. Do you feel like it's become a much more sophisticated beast flashing forward to 2019?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot more focus now on the negative impacts of technology on society. And for a long time in the Web 2.0 era, it was very, very much about, very much an economic focus and about the techno-optimism of, people like Tim O'Reilly, Kevin Kelly. So that was kind of driving that whole Web 2.0 era. And so a lot of us kind of had blinders on about the potential negative consequences of all this technology. And so I feel like now, especially in the last year or two, that kind of coverage and that kind of analysis has really improved a lot. There's been a lot of really interesting stuff about privacy, for example. So I feel like the technology coverage now is more balanced, and it needed to go in that direction. But it's still very driven by the big companies. So that would be my main kind of critique of where the technology coverage is at. It's all about what Facebook does, what Google does, what Apple does. Those big companies are driving almost all the coverage. And I was a Twitter thread recently. Ross Mayfield, who runs a company called PingPad, he was complaining that it's really difficult for startups to get coverage these days because there aren't any TechCrunches or ReadWriteWebs jumping on startup technology and trying to reviewing, because a lot of what I did and what Michael Arrington did and even Pete Cashmore in the early days would actually use these products and test startup products and review them. And so I feel like there's a bit of a gap in the coverage there, that there's a lot of the startup stuff is not being explored as much as it perhaps could be. And it's a little bit too heavy on the big tech companies. But otherwise, it's constantly evolving, as you know, and I still love reading technology blogs like The Verge and those types of the content that they do. So it's still in a very healthy state, I think, overall.
Okay, Richard. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
They can go to cybercultural.com. That's my Substack email newsletter. They can also find me on Twitter at RickMac, RICMAC. And my website is rickmac.org.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.